Today, we'll be looking at a classic novel written by one of the greatest authors who ever lived. Patron Radatosk has asked for The Left Hand of Darkness, published by Ursula K. Le Guin in 1969. About the author. Ursula K. Le Guin was born in 1929, the daughter of an anthropologist and a writer. Thanks to her parents' professions and their remarkable permissiveness for the era, Le Guin grew up surrounded by academics, scientists, authors, and Native Americans. She attended Radcliffe College, the all-woman alternative to the all-men Harvard College, and she got a master's degree by studying Renaissance French and Italian literature. In 1953, Ursula began her doctorate studies by traveling to France, but on the way there, she met her future husband Charles Le Guin and chose to abandon her doctorate and marry him instead. This was apparently a good call on her part, because the two would remain married until her death in early 2018. Le Guin's writing career technically began when she was 11 years old and submitted her first story, and throughout the 1950s she wrote 5 novels but couldn't get any of them published, apparently because of inaccessibility. The genre fiction ghetto may have had something to do with it, but I can only speculate. Either way, in the 1960s she would start to get regularly published, and towards the end of the decade she created the Earthsea setting, which includes 6 books and several short stories. The 1960s is also the decade in which she created the Hainish cycle. This is a science fiction setting in which travel between solar systems is less than light speed, but communication between planets can be instantaneous thanks to a device called the Ansible. In ancient times, the human species evolved on the planet Hain, and then they colonized nearby planets, including Earth. Colonization and communication then ended for some reason, and in the present of the novel series, Hain has started sending ambassadors and Ansibles to restore communications and induct planets into a peaceful confederacy. Since space travel is so slow and expensive, planetary invasions are both rare and highly impractical. With that all being said, the interstellar story of the Hainish cycle is most often in the background. It's used as an excuse to have an outsider protagonist explore the politics and unusual characteristics of a planet. And along with normal genetic divergence, it turns out that the ancient Hainish people also sent out colonies of genetic experiments. This fact is very much in play in The Left Hand of Darkness. So how about I get on with it and discuss the story. I've already mentioned the setting background, so let me start with the novel's background. The protagonist, Genli I, is a visitor from Terra, from Earth, and he's an official envoy from the Ecumen, the society of planets that share knowledge and philosophies using Ansibles. Genli's job is to formally make contact with the planet Gethen's civilizations and invite them to join the Ecumen. If they say no, then he'll leave and come back 30 years later, but if they say yes, then a few more Ecumen envoys who are in cryosleep in an orbiting vessel will come down to join him. For now though, Genli is alone and unarmed, so that he's as unthreatening as possible. However, Genli is not the first Ecumen visitor to Gethen. They earlier sent an investigation team who learned the planet's customs, languages, and other important details. Chief among those details, in this case, is the fact that Gethenian humans have no separate sexes. For 24 days out of every 26, Gethenians have no sexual urges and underdeveloped sexual attributes. But for those last 2 days, they go into Kemer, into heat, basically, and they develop male or female sexual organs, basically at random. There are a couple of exceptions. Staying close to someone in Kemer can make someone develop the opposite sexual organs, so marriage exists, but it's not as big a deal, and both partners can be mother and father to their children. That said, the book uses male pronouns for everyone, but that's strictly because of the limitations of the English language and the fact that the man, Genli, is the book's narrator. Then there's the political situation on Gethen. The planet is just coming out of a long ice age, and as such there are only 2 major nations on Gethen, even though the technology is roughly on par with early 20th century Earth. There are also only 2 nations because Gethenians don't really go to war. They'll commit every other tragedy and atrocity known to humankind, but it's only recently that the two major nations have had the ability to go to war thanks to the frozen climate. The two nations on Gethin are Karhide and Orgoray, and Genly chooses to land in Karhide's territory. Karhide is ruled by a king, but the king is widely considered insane by his own people and even his own chancellors. This includes Estraven, Karhide's prime minister and the person who helped defend and promote Genly's cause since he arrived 2 years ago. However, soon after the book begins, Estraven is exiled from the kingdom. This is a political move based on Shifgrathor, basically a detailed system of formalities that Genly doesn't quite understand even with the investigation team's help. Estraven made too many mistakes while defending Genly, and so his political enemies managed to exile him. On the bright side, Estraven managed to give Genly an audience with the king, but the audience comes to nothing because the king is too mad and too stupid to care about talking to aliens on other worlds. There's also the fact that, from the Gethenian point of view, aliens are all perverts who constantly have their genitalia out and have sex all the time, and that's just way too disturbing for Karhide's court. Still, Genly is permitted to go where he pleases, so he takes advantage of the end of the planet's long winter to head east and explore the kingdom's countryside. Along the way, Genly learns about fastnesses, remote communities built in the frozen mountains that practice a religion called Handarata. To the investigators, Handarata seemed to be a creedless, formless religion, but they did still have a position called the Foreteller. Genly asks for a foretelling and watches the long ceremony, and after asking the question, will Gethin be a member of the Ecumen in 5 years, he gets a remarkably direct yes for an answer. The book then spends a chapter on what Estraven has been up to since his exile. He's been living on the bottom rung in Orgoray, which it turns out is basically a police state. As such, the people in charge of his sector know who he is, and when they talk to him about escalating tensions between the two nations, they also bring up Genly I. Estraven sees him as a way out of factionalism and war, and he encourages the Orgorain leaders to accept his request to cross the border. Sure enough, when the perspective switches back to Genly, he makes his travel request and eventually gets accepted. However, the border town he's in gets attacked in the night, forcing him to flee without his papers or passport. This gets him in trouble when he reaches the nearest communal farm. Luckily, someone realizes who he is and escorts him to Mishnuri, the capital of Orgoray. There, he's treated with respect and reunites with Estraven. Estraven gives Genly a vague warning, but Genly moves forward anyway. The main problem he has is that his supporters in Orgorain want proof that he's an alien, but his landing pod is locked up in Karhide, and he refuses to bring the starship down with the rest of his crew on it until after he gets some kind of guarantee from the government. A guarantee they won't give without proof. Orgorain also keeps Genly a state secret instead of broadcasting everything about him like they did in Karhide. As such, it's easier for them to secretly arrest Genly and send him off to what's essentially a gulag. The labor camp where Genly ends up is the sort of place where people disappear, but it's not a death camp for anyone except Genly. See, the prisoners in the camp are forced to take anti-chemer drugs to keep them focused on work, but Genly isn't from this planet and the drugs make him sick. That, and they keep interrogating him with truth drugs, and he gets worse after every session. Fortunately, Estraven is still looking out for Genly. Estraven finds the labor camp where they put Genly, he fakes being a guard, and then he fakes Genly's death so that the two of them can escape. He then helps Genly recover, and the two decide to return to Karhide by crossing the glacier that borders both nations. Most of the rest of the book is a person versus nature account. No politics, no space travel, no relationship problems, just two individuals trying to cross a deadly glacier. There's just one revelation that happens during this trip. Genly realizes that Estraven is not only a man, he's also a woman. When they finally reach Karhide, Estraven is shot dead since he's still in exile. Fortunately, his plan still works. Orgorain has said that Genly die, so when Karhide proves them wrong, the king gets so much prestige that he agrees to let Genly call down the rest of the Ecumen envoy. Genly's mission is a success, but it cost him someone close to him. and after spending 3 years on Gethin, the male and female faces of his fellow envoys look alien to him now. The analysis. You don't exactly have to read between the lines to figure out what this book is about. It's about sex and gender, plain and simple. And all the parts of the book that are about other stuff are also about how sex and gender affect them. What if there were a world with no genders? No men, no women, not even any transgenders or gender fluids. For 24 days out of every 26, nobody is male or female. And during those last 2 days, you're in heat, and therefore completely willing to do the deed with anyone who has the opposite genitalia. There would be no such thing as rape or sexual dominance because, much like with many animal species, the need to breed becomes too overwhelming to ignore. Individuals can control their sexuality by taking drugs to induce Kemer early or skip a cycle, but once you're in Kemer, it becomes extremely hard to control your actions. But here's the thing. As Le Guin explains in one of her expository chapters, gender does exist even on Gethin. Around 3 to 4% of the population, thanks to genetic anomalies, adopt a single sex and maintain it all year round. And regardless of which sex they happen to be, regular Gethenians refer to them as perverts. Or at least that's the closest English word Genly can think of. Perverts are considered dangerous sexual beasts because they constantly produce the pheromones that trigger early Kemerings and produce the opposite sex in the people they influence. You might say that Gethenian perverts have weaponized sex in a society where nobody has sex for fun, so they really have no parallel to the sexual minorities on Earth. Then there's the family unit. Like I said before, Gethin has something resembling marriage, and the humans of Gethin are certainly familiar with love and affection, but romance doesn't exist as such because sex isn't an end goal for any relationship. Two individuals can swear Kemering together, which means they'll always seek each other out when they enter Kemer and only have children by each other, but this is considered exceptional, not routine. And like on Earth, Kemering pairs can end up falling out of love and separating. Another note, incest is significantly less of a big deal on Gethin, because the Kemer state does not make an exception for blood-related partners. Something else that's interesting about Gethin is the sort of disconnect between parents and children. The parents are still loving and dote on their children, but they do so much more for the children they mother than for the children they father. Gethenians also tend to raise their kids more communally than the average Earth couple, partly because anybody can become a single parent, and partly because the Oedipus-Electra complexes don't exist. And let me just remind you, this book was written in the 1960s. This lack of gender and sex-based psychological differences also affects other aspects of people's lives. Gethenian nations don't have nearly the kind of hierarchy that most Earth political systems have. You have the King of Karhide, of course, but the king is often ignored even though his will is still technically law. Instead, the kingdom has a bunch of counselors running around and vying for power by basically avoiding direct confrontations and trying to force each other into embarrassing themselves. And I should add that, while this is a traditionally feminine approach to power dynamics, it's also very cultural. The politicians of Orgoreign are much more direct. That brings us to Orgoreign. Karhide is a pre-nation-state monarchy, a collection of independent city-states that pay taxes to the king and keep up the news about him, but otherwise do their own thing. Orgoreign is a proper nation-state, and it's ruled by a council of 33 equals. And yet, even without the sharp hierarchy you'd see on Earth, Orgoreign still manages to oppress its citizens. Police checkpoints are everywhere, and it's a saying in the country that you're better off naked with your papers than clothed without them. Orgoreign also has political prisoners, work camps, and oppressed minorities. The point Le Guin seems to be making here is that male aggression isn't a necessary component of an oppressive nation. The fact that we hate each other, the fact that we hurt each other and treat each other like garbage, all of that comes from somewhere deeper than our gender identities, somewhere more essentially human. Then there's that last part of the book, the ride across the glacier. Even this part is a study on gender, because it shows us a time and a place where gender means nothing. On that glacier, every question has to be about survival. If you can pull the sledge, you pull the sledge. If you can spot glacier rifts, you'll spot glacier rifts. If you're too exhausted to move, then you sit in the sledge. Gender, sex, maybe that will have an impact on how often you do what, but only if they have a physical impact on what you can do. You cannot wield gender or sex as a weapon on a glacier. You do what you can, no matter what that is, because if you don't, you die. I believe the glacier section comes last because it strips away all the pretensions, all the politics and the assumptions. Gender is a social construct because when you are hanging on the side of a wall of ice, it doesn't matter. How you identify yourself, who you love, none of that matters on the glacier. Now you could certainly argue that these things have everything to do with reproduction, but the thing about humans is that reproduction, sex, love, all of that is a social exercise. So why would gender not be a part of that social experience? If we can leave it behind when we need to survive, and then bring it back up when we're comfortable, why would you think that gender and gender roles are immutable? Why would you think that gender is two separate things, when all it can do is label a long list of your individual traits, traits that don't always match up to those labels? All of us are men, and all of us are women. Because while gender roles can apply in the generic, each of us has a list of traits that belong in both categories. That is what Genli Ai discovers on that glacier. Thanks for joining me again for today's book review, and I hope I'll see you next time for a story about the devil and the service industry.